Welcome to this video that is to do with State of the Nation, Freedom of Religion or Belief in the United Kingdom. This is sponsored by Freedom Declared Foundation. Freedom Declared is a charity within the United Kingdom that aims to gather first-hand evidence to understand people's perception of freedom of religion or belief in the United Kingdom. We aim to understand what people believe freedom of religion or belief means and how this compares to the international obligations the UK has signed up to. We also aim to understand if people believe the United Kingdom is living up to the obligations it signed up to, and if not, where is it falling short? For more information, please feel free to follow us on social media at Freedom Declared. We're very pleased to be joined today by Andrew Copson. Andrew Copson has been Chief Executive of Humanist UK since 2009 and elected President of Humanists International since 2015. He is a former director of the Religious Education Council of England and Wales, the Values Education Council, and the National Council for Faiths and Beliefs in Further Education. His books include the Sunday Times bestseller, The Little Book of Humanism, and The Little Book of Humanist Weddings, written with Alice Roberts, Secularism, A Very Short Introduction, and the Wiley-Blackwell Handbook of Humanism with A C Grayling. Thank you so much for joining with us today, Andrew.
It's a pleasure.
So we're just going to start with a question, which is how do you understand the term and the responsibility with regards to freedom of religion and belief?
Well, I think most humanists like to recast it in the language of the original human right in many ways and think about the freedom of thought, conscience and religion or belief. And it really is just, for me, the foundational freedom. The idea is that every person, every human being should be free to make up their own mind. And free to have the resources they need to make up their own mind. There should be free exchange of ideas, free expression of ideas, free interchange of ideas, and that no public body, no government, no state, no agency should ever try and disrupt that freedom by restricting access to information, by coercing you, by disadvantaging you, or by advantaging you with certain beliefs, religions, or ideas. And so that idea, which is really one about human development and human potential, and everyone having the opportunity to develop their own individuality as a unique person, is what I think freedom of religion and belief is all about.
Fantastic. That links really well with Article 18 of the UN Declaration as well, doesn't it? So you've kind of encapsulated that.
Yes,
so
it does. I don't think that's an accident. I think that the two, there's a lot of ideas in Article 18 and in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that are, shared ideas that are shared between different religious and non-religious traditions all around the world. And that means there are a lot of ideas in it that are very humanist, in the very shared value sense of humanistic beliefs. And so I think that, it's not a coincidence.
I mean, it's interesting for me because if I think about my lifetime, and I'm getting on a little bit.
No.
Certainly for the first period of my life, probably for the first 20 or 30 years, whenever freedom of religion was spoken about, it was spoken about as freedom of religion rather than
religious freedom.
Or religious freedom, rather than freedom of religion or belief. So what do you think has changed within society, or has it changed within society to include those with non-religious worldviews? And
it's a very interesting question, because I think my experience of working in the field of freedom, religion or belief for the last sort of 16 or 17 years, internationally and nationally, and those two things are sometimes quite different, has been that there have, for a long time, for many decades, perhaps been almost two schools within the wider Article 18 space. One has been the religious freedom school, very influenced quite often by United States type thinking about religious liberty and that tradition within their own constitution and culture. And that's about making sure that you can practice your religion. The state can't stop you doing your religious thing, whatever you want to do, within some limits. But the limits aren't there in the Constitution of the US. The limits have developed since, right? So there's a religious freedom tradition, and then there is a sort of freedom of thought and conscience tradition, which, like I alluded to a moment ago, stands more in the sort of European Enlightenment type, humanistic, intellectually free, freedom of debate, freedom of expression type tradition. And I think those two very much expressed in human rights terms in the modern world. And I think those two traditions have moved sort of closer together in the last couple of decades, as lots of factors behind that. I think religious groups and churches have moved closer to the human rights, freedom of belief, freedom of thought framework, because they think it offers a good way to achieve the protections that they're looking for, the legal protections they're looking for, and also a good language on the international stage to be able to argue for what in their hearts is religious freedom, but it can be expressed in terms of freedom of religion or belief. And I think that for those who are part maybe of the more, not abstract, but the more sort of ideological tradition of freedom of thought, have embraced that idea that we could be talking about freedom of religion or belief, where belief includes non-religious beliefs such as anyone might have embraced that, because the concept of freedom of religion or belief makes real, concretizes the sort of problems that are faced in the world today. Freedom of thought and conscience can seem very abstract, but when you start talking about freedom of religion or belief, and the people who have beliefs and their ability to express their beliefs and not be restricted in expressing their beliefs, it becomes suddenly more real and sort of more vivid. So I think that's what's happened in general terms in the last 10 or 15 years. I don't think it's the case that non-religious beliefs have come into religious freedom. I think it's that two schools have met really and sort of coalesced.
Yeah, that's interesting from my perspective, because I think it's people like you, because obviously I work within religious education. It's people like you who have helped me understand that it is far more than religious freedom, that it has to include, and so bringing those two. So I perhaps was on not one side of the fence, but on concerned with religion.
Yes.
You were not necessarily solely concerned with belief or freedom of thought, but kind of recognizing that you were going through the same issues that perhaps lots of religious people are going through, and enables us to come together. So that's been really interesting for me as a religious educator, to kind of see that it isn't just about religious freedom, that it's about religion and belief and worldviews and all of those things. But that leads us on to, I guess, a question is, how well in the UK generally are we doing with regards to freedom of religion and belief from your perspective?
Well, I like to resist the temptation that lots of people have to sort of diss their own country more than others because they're more familiar with it, so they see its faults more closely. It is obviously the case that in the whatever it is now, is it 190, about that many sort of states in the world, that the UK is obviously near the top end of states in the world today, maybe states in the world ever, that respect and promote freedom of religion or belief. But I would say that it's at the bottom end of the first division in terms of its practices. And sometimes that can feel very strange to us, actually, when you live in a country, when you're enculturated into it, and you see its ways as just being how things are. You don't really realize sometimes how extreme an outlier you can be. We are, for example, the only sovereign state in the world to mandate daily Christian worship in our state schools. That's everyone would in England certainly, but in most parts of the UK, we just think it was probably normal. Probably in schools everywhere they have prayers and hymns in the morning, and children are expected to. Not the case, not the case at all. We're the only sovereign state to require it. We're the only state apart from Iran to have members of the state church sitting in parliament as a right. A very clear example of the state advantaging people with a particular religion or belief. We're one of only 4 countries in the OECD to allow state schools to select pupils on religious grounds, to choose pupils for state schools based on their parents' religion. I think that's not Estonia, Ireland, Israel, I think. That's not allowed in any other country. Freedom of religion or belief in every other democracy, developed economy and democracy in the world would completely ban that practice, which we accept as almost normal. Parents accept they're going to have to maybe go to church to get their child into this school or that school or whatever, and it's just it's an egregious practice. So there's all sorts of ways in which the UK, which is often the way that human rights violations happen in the UK, sort of quietly by convention. Things, human rights are violated, but with a soft language of, parental choice in the case of the human rights violations around school admissions, or history, Christian culture and history in the case of mandatory prayer in state schools, and so on and so forth. So I think there are many ways in which UK law and practice violates international standards, and these are of course pointed out by the UN rapporteurs quite often. I've mentioned there are only ones that affect, perhaps unduly affect non-religious people, but of course there are many that affect religious people too, or people of the wrong religion. If you
Yes, because I mean, I'm listening to those, and I'm religious, but wrong religious, I guess, would be the phrase. So some of those would affect me, but I look at those as well, and we have the collective worship since 1944, I think.
Yes, very controversial when it was introduced. Much more controversial in 1944 than it is today, probably, actually.
And then faith schools, 1860, somewhere around there, with the
difficult to be sure. I mean, probably again 1944 in the current system, although probably 1988 properly in the current system, because in 1944, when a lot of church schools were brought into the state system, they were only given these privileges of selection and so on, and special teaching, because they paid 50% of the running costs. And between 1944 and now, of course, that's completely gone. So it became 40%, then 30%, then 20%, and now, of course, all of the running costs of religious state schools, so-called faith schools, are met by the state. So there's a sort of the state's upheld its end of the bargain, as it were, but the churches haven't. But yes, let's say 1944 is probably better.
But if they're historical, how does that change? Because as you say, they've just become, all of those three things are the accepted fabric of society. There have been calls in the past for a reform of the House of Lords, but maybe it's just what I listen to, but I haven't really heard that for the last 15, 20 years in mainstream media.
In 2011, removing bishops from the House of Lords was the most popular request in public consultation on constitutional reform that was held by the Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg at the time. When it looked like the Lib Dems in the coalition of the time at the UK level might manage some constitutional reform, which of course they didn't in the end. But when it was possible that they might, there was a public consultation, and I was very surprised. But removing bishops from the House of Lords was the most frequently requested constitutional change to the government constitution at the time. So there is, I think, below the surface, I think there is quite a feeling about this. And of course, public opinion polling on worship in schools, on faith-based RE, and on school admissions does always show a large majority of the public in favour of reform. But it's not their top issue. No. It's not their strongest issue, and that's how a lot of change doesn't happen, of course, in liberal democracies, is that a lot of people care about it, but they don't carry it into their top 5 issues. And so it doesn't become something that politicians focus on.
So that's really interesting. So we've kind of talked about the general things that are within society, but how do they affect the individual? I don't know, humanist or whoever it might, non-religious person or whoever that may be. How do these things, and I know it will seem obvious, but how do these things disadvantage the individual, I guess?
Well, a parent who can't get their child into their local state school that their taxes are paying for because it's run by a religious group, and it prefers and gives legal priority to the children of a particular religion, is obviously disadvantaged. And of course, that's one of the situations that Humanist UK, because we give legal and other advice to parents and teachers, and it's one of the things that we do in our work. That's something that comes up all year round. I mean, it rises to a peak in the part of the year when parents are choosing schools, but all year round it's a problem, and that's a massive disadvantage in all sorts of ways. An equal disadvantage actually is the flip side of the coin, which we also get a lot of casework on, is parents who have no choice other than to send their child to a religious school, because it's the only school in the area, right? So huge number of primary schools, especially in rural England, are Church of England schools. And although they vary in their religiosity, some of them are at the very religious end of things. And, the sort of curriculum that is in what, of course, is called the curriculum subject of RE in those schools, but it's quite different from the curriculum subject of RE that you find in community schools very often. But, the sort of worksheets that come home about taking Christian beliefs to be true, presuming Christian beliefs to be true, and that's what's being taught at school, of course, is very difficult for parents. Very hard for a parent, a Jewish parent or a Muslim parent or a humanist parent, to have that difficult conversation with their child where they explain why they should believe their teacher, or when they're talking about history, but why when the teacher's talking about Jesus, that's not actually what we believe at home, or whatever it is. And so that's of course disadvantage. The same in worship, naturally. I mean, we supported a legal case just recently where parents were saying, it wasn't right for their child, because the parents, the child actually in that case, didn't want to participate in Christian religious practices, which were going on in assembly, why it wasn't right for their child, because they didn't want to participate in those practices, to be thereby effectively excluded from a large part of the common life of the school, the assembly that was taking place, which was about community building and shared values, in addition to the religious practices that were going on. And so that's a clear disadvantage. In terms of the curriculum, again, any curriculum that indicates to a child that a particular way of looking at things is true when it comes to matters of religion is an obvious violation of freedom of religion or belief. Because although it may be lightly coercive, it's nonetheless coercive. It is, giving an official seal of approval to a particular religion or belief, even if it allows contestation of that truth within the classroom, let's say, it still gives a preferred status to it. And of course, that's a structural disadvantage for people who don't share that belief. So in all that, I mean, we're sticking with the same three issues all the way through. Of course, there are many other issues that we could talk about as well, but that's just a few of the real world disadvantages.
I mean, it's interesting because in my day job, obviously, I train teachers and help teachers become RE teachers. And one of the things that I say is we need to be neutral. So when we teach about Christianity, Christians do this, Muslims do this, Hindus do this. It's never we do this, they do this.
Yeah, that's so important.
It's about the positive neutrality. But almost when my students go into a faith school, that kind of goes out the window, and it is we do this and they do that. So it's interesting.
And that's legal, I mean, that's the strange thing, I think, because a lot of people don't realize that as well. I think there's a lot of people who don't realize that the law is different in those different types of state school, because they're all state schools, the power of the in-group and the out-group in these schools, is remarkably strong. And it's the sort of thing that when you focus on it through the frame or the lens of freedom of religion or belief, you can bring into focus how wrong it is, which is not immediately apparent.
So we've talked about kind of three issues, but I know that one issue that Humanist UK campaign an awful lot on, and I don't think people are aware this is the case, is the wedding ceremony in England. I'm not sure. I think it's fine in Scotland, isn't it?
In Scotland and Northern Ireland, humanist weddings are recognised as legal marriages. That's right.
So do you want to explain that issue slightly for us?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a complicated issue, in fact, but so in most parts of the UK, most jurisdictions of the UK, and the UK is made up of different legal systems, as probably everyone who's watching this is aware. The legal system in Northern Ireland is different from the one in Scotland, which is different from the one in England and Wales, and so on and so forth. The different types of marriage are recognised. Broadly speaking, there are three types of marriage that are recognised in different parts of the UK. So you recognise religious marriages, where you can be married by the responsible officer of your religion, whatever they might be, minister, imam, rabbi, whatever it might be, in a religious ceremony, and that's recognised as a legal marriage. So there's religious marriages. There's civil marriages, which is where a state registrar will perform a ceremony. It can be very brief, or sometimes it's much longer. It's still prescribed by the state, but there's some choice between different options. A state registrar will marry you, and it's a legal marriage conducted either in a register office or in a registered place. It depends. That's slightly different around the UK. Different places are recognised around the UK in different ways. And then the third type of marriage that appears in different laws within the UK is humanist marriage, and that is where a humanist celebrant from a humanist organisation can legally marry you. And what makes it different from the civil marriage is that the ceremony reflects humanist beliefs and values, and is much more, because of the focus that humanism has on individuals, their unique lives, the unique nature of their relationships and so on, is much more focused on the individuals involved, their personal beliefs, their personal values, their personal story. And the celebrant shares the values of the couple, of course, which civil registrars don't. If I go to the registrar office to be married, I might be married by a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew or an atheist. I actually wouldn't care who married me if I was having just a civil registrar marriage, and many people don't, and that's fine. But the point is that some people do, and just as religious people can choose their officer of their religion to do the marriage that is important to them, expresses their values, so many couples choose the humanist celebrant because a humanist is what they are, even though they might not identify themselves as a humanist, which of course is the weird thing about non-religious beliefs versus religions, is almost everyone with religious beliefs identifies themselves by the name of the religious belief they have. But most people with humanist beliefs and values don't call themselves humanists. They just call themselves, that's what I think, or they don't identify themselves as anything, which is a interesting difference between religions and non-religious worldviews quite often. So in Northern Ireland and in Scotland, humanist weddings are legally recognised. In England and Wales, they're not, and the reason why not is largely government inertia, apathy, and sort of general can't be botheredness. At some times in the last 7 years, there's been a little bit of anti-humanist prejudice, I think, in the failure to recognise humanist marriages, but mostly it's been lack of positive commitment, inertia, rather than actual opposition. Humanist marriages were created as a possible category of marriage in the law in England and Wales in 2013, because there was a majority in Parliament to recognise humanist marriage, and the government didn't want Parliament to defeat the government on a vote on this in Parliament at a bill that was going through at the time. So the government made a concession, which is that they created the category of non-religious belief marriages to include humanists in marriage law in England and Wales. So there is legally a category for humanist marriage, but the government's compromise was that although they would create that category, they would give the government the power of actually activating the legal right at a later date. And so our technical position, this is getting very technical, is that the humanist marriages exist in England and Wales, but they've not yet been authorised by the government to start happening. And the government has the power to start them happening by order. So there's an order-making power in the marriage law of England and Wales that allows the government to lay an order to give legal recognition to humanist marriages, but it just hasn't done it.
So why not? Why haven't they done it?
I mean, right at the beginning, there was a bit of opposition from Church of England. I don't really know why, but in any case, that opposition has now been dropped, and most parts of the Church of England is a complicated organisation, so you can't say the Church of England, but most parts of it, some parts of the Church of England are still against legal humanist marriage. Other parts of it are now saying, well, it's fair enough. If we think that Christians should be allowed to get married in a Christian ceremony, why shouldn't humanists be allowed to get married in a humanist ceremony? And that's the right thing. That's good that many parts of the Church of England are thinking that now. That's just and fair. And I think generally, it is quite difficult to know why it hasn't happened. There has been bad luck, as the order was coming through, the coalition government ended, then there was the Brexit referendum, and there was general elections. There was always something big happening that meant they couldn't look at it. The government kicked the whole issue into the long grass by saying that instead of doing it, they wanted to have a review of all of marriage law in England and Wales, which at the time when that review was first committed to was absolutely a way of just kicking the whole issue into the long grass. But because that review had then begun, the existence of that review, which is still ongoing, gave a new sort of more legitimate pretext to waiting to see what that review would do before looking at humanists. So we've just been dragged along on a piece of string really for the last how long is it now? It's almost 10 years. I mean, it'll be 10 years next year.
But this inertia had implications for COVID, didn't it, as well? Because when So I remember, because my
That's
daughter
right.
was married, they allowed weddings of 30, and that was great. But for humanists, that wasn't allowed at first, was it?
No, that's right. I mean, you're exactly right. This disparity of treatment between humanists and religious people in marriage law is a FORB violation, and indeed, the High Court has a judge in the High Court has said this. You know, that this is the case. Freedom of religion or belief and the principle of non-discrimination means that the current situation where humanists are treated differently from religious people in marriage law is unsustainable. The court fought shy of actually forcing the government to do anything about it. They said the government should be given more time to deal with it because of the review of marriage law. But you're right that when the COVID regulations were being made in particular, the disparity between humanists in marriage law and religious people had a real significance, because the COVID law, as we know, for the first time in English history, wasn't it, that we could only do what we were told we could do, and so of course they said you could get married if certain conditions applied, and they didn't include non-legally recognized weddings. So religious people were able to continue having their weddings, albeit with smaller numbers, as we all remember, which is a shame for many people. But humanist weddings were effectively banned. And so you're right, the government eventually changed the rules after a threat of legal action, actually. But nonetheless, you know, fair credit to them, they did change we didn't have to go to court, they did change the rule. But it was a good example of how an underlying structural disparity between the treatment of religious people and the treatment of people with non-religious beliefs gave rise to, you know, a very real injustice very suddenly, when, you know, an emergency happened and the underlying infrastructure of our law in relation to freedom of religion belief wasn't fit for purpose.
That's really interesting. So was that a result? I mean, because I assume they didn't do it purposely. Think, I know we're going to mistreat the humanists.
No.
So I guess one of the things that's come out of the other interviews that we've done is a lack of literacy with regards to religion and non-religion. So government and other agencies kind of know, I know, the Church of England and the established churches essentially, but anything beyond that narrow norm, and I'll use the word norm even though that's not right, is kind of not ignored, but it isn't known about.
It doesn't feature in their thinking.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. Actually, there's the Church of England, there's the Catholic Church, there's, you know, the chief rabbi, who, you know, often the government expects to cover all of British Jewry, it seems, which is obviously not the case. And, you know, there might be some free churches that they consult from time to time. But I think you're right. Largely, there is no wider religious and non-religious worldviews, knowledge, literacy, expertise in policy or in sociological terms in government. I think that is definitely true, and it leads to, I suppose, thoughtlessness.
Yeah. So what can the government do then, do you think, or the wider machinations of government?
Well, I think that there are. You know, I'm a secularist, right? So I think that government should be, you know, hands off religion and belief as much as it can be. I think that religious and humanist organisations, you know, should be separate from the state, and the state should be separate from them, and there shouldn't be any undue domination of one set of those institutions by the other. You know, I think the English Constitution is a disaster in relation to this principle, and so I think that most of government should simply treat religion and belief groups as they would any other civil society, you know, self-organized groups in civil society. That's not our situation.
No.
In practice. And so there is a case for increasing the policy and social knowledge of particularly civil servants, of course, who are working on these things. I think that a national commission that actually looked at the interplay, you know, a fixed term couple of years commission that looked at the interplay of religion and belief with law and policy in England and Wales, at least, would be a very good idea to try and bring that external expertise in to inform government. There was a commission on religion and belief in British public life, which I was a commissioner on, but it was, although the government was interested in it, it wasn't an official government commission. It was set up by the Wolf Institute and chaired by Baroness Butler Sloss, former judge. Which is very interesting, and it included people of a wide range of different expertises in policy terms and of different religions and beliefs. And those recommendations, I think, were very good. And if they'd been taken up by the government, that would have been quite good. But in the absence of, so anyway, my original point, in the absence of internal policy expertise within government, perhaps some sort of, external expertise got through a commission or advisory groups or whatever. But even if there were, Britain were to become a secular state tomorrow, which of course is not going to happen, then there would still be areas of policy where religion and belief will always feature, where the state will never be able to entirely remain completely distant from important concepts of religion and belief, like education, for example. No serious person, I don't think, no serious person in education in England or any part of the UK ever thinks that we would go down the American or the French style school curriculum with no references to religion type. Most people, and all serious people, I think, believe that the school curriculum should address questions of religious and non-religious beliefs, for good citizenship reasons, because they're part of the human culture and heritage, because they can be key to personal development in all sorts of ways for young people. That's the consensus, I would say. So in education, there'll always be the need to be aware of both religious and non-religious beliefs and freedom of religion or belief. The education system curriculum in this country does not in any way correspond to freedom of religion and belief principles, at all. So there'll be that need, and there'll also be, of course, in a state which takes such an interest in social life as the British state does, there'll always be a role for experts in religion and belief in social policy as well. So I think in those areas, government's just got to retain and train expertise, bring people in or contact them from outside.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. So one final just thing. And you mentioned before that kind of in terms of freedom of religion and belief, we're kind of first division, maybe towards the bottom of that.
Or top of the second division, actually. I've moderated my views. The first division is rather small there globally in this terms, of course.
So I guess, how do we do as a society? How does the UK do at promoting religion and the freedom of religion and belief around the world, where there are places with blasphemy laws still where you can be locked up for being a humanist?
Yes, that's right. I think that there are a couple of dozen countries where to even be a humanist is illegal. You cannot, on your identity papers, as far as the state is concerned, be a humanist. That's not possible. So, and there are widespread violations against people of all different religions and beliefs globally. It's a key human rights issue for everyone. Well, the British state, the UK government abroad has often talked quite a good game on freedom of religion or belief, and I think that's to be welcomed. And I also know that they're not just talk, they're not all talk. There have been some great initiatives from in the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office on freedom of religion or belief, but I don't think it's prioritised in the way that it should be, and I don't think that the UK is hard enough on the violators of this particular freedom. Thinking recently, for example, in Kano State in Nigeria, the president of the Humanist Association of Nigeria has been in prison now for over 2 years, and arrested without trial, detained without trial on a trumped-up blasphemy charge. And the UK government has made very supportive noises to some extent, and I believe has spoken privately also to officials, but they've also just launched a new economic partnership in Kano State, and talked up the wonderfulness of Kano State and how they'll drive opportunity, and this will be wonderful for human rights as well. And that's those two things just aren't compatible. And I think that the UK needs to do better at that. We also, frankly, look like a hypocrite quite often. Right. It's very difficult for the government of the UK to say, for example, to the government of China, the state shouldn't be choosing bishops and appointing bishops in churches because you'd have freedom of religion or belief, when the UK state appoints bishops. And of course, I know and you know that the two situations are far from analogous. You know, the process by which bishops are appointed in the Church of England and the process whereby religious leaders are, you know, put into position by the government of China are not really comparable, apart from in the principle, where it's quite legitimate for China to say, who are you to talk? Just as it was, you know, legitimate until recently for states where there are blasphemy laws to say back to the UK, well, you've got a blasphemy law. You know, your law protects Christianity. In England, the blasphemy law protected even more narrowly Anglicanism. You know, only the Anglican God was protected from blasphemy, and so, you know, why shouldn't we have a blasphemy law? You're a Christian country, we're a Muslim country. Oof.
So do you think that we need to improve our domestic freedom of religion?
So I think we do. That's exactly where I'm going with this. That's right. I think that the UK should do two things. Firstly, it should follow up its rhetoric abroad with action abroad, and not be complicit with human rights violations around freedom of religion or belief by its inaction or its apparent hypocrisy with trade deals, with economic actions, and so on. And the second thing I think the UK should do is clean up its own house. And
that would be by, I don't know.
I think there should be a thoroughgoing review of UK law and policy in relation to freedom of religion or belief, to check that it is compatible with Article 18 and address those areas where it isn't. I mean, the OSCE, which of course is a very important international body, and has done a lot of work on freedom of religion or belief, produced very good guidelines for how states could review their legislation pertaining to religion or belief, and some even better guidelines in relation to how states could review their law and education as it pertains to religion or belief. As far as I can tell, the UK, in spite of being a key proponent of that whole exercise by the OSCE and some really top quality British experts sitting on the panels that produced those documents, the UK has never once asked itself, you know, what should we do about this? How could we revise our laws pertaining to freedom of religion or belief? Never.
We need to stop resting on our laurels then and kind of be honest with ourselves as we move forward.
Especially when our laurels aren't that fresh.
And maybe, are a bit spiky. Well, thank you so much for your time though, Andrew. It's been really good. Are there any final comments you want to make on any of the areas that we've discussed?
No, not at all. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I think the work of Freedom Declared Foundation is very important.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much for your time. I just remind listeners that if you would like to follow us on social media, we are at Freedom Declared, and there are a whole number of videos that we are working through as well. So thank you for your time, Andrew, and thank you everybody for listening.